Across the Atlantic islands of Britain and Ireland, several native languages still exist with long and complex histories. In the rugged countryside and vibrant cities of Wales, we find Cymraeg, whereas in Ireland, the people there continue to speak Gaeilge. These languages are not simply relics of the past. They are among the last living descendants of what researchers call the insular Celtic branch of the wider Indo-European language family. Their origins lie in an ancient tongue once spoken thousands of miles away on the Eurasian steppe, far from the misty shores of the British and Irish Isles. But this raises an interesting question. How did these languages travel such an immense distance from the heart of Eurasia to the islands of the far west? The answer takes us back over 5,000 years to the vast grasslands between the Black and Caspian Seas, to a culture archaeologists call the Yamnaya. We don't know what they called themselves, but their migrations would forever reshape the peoples, languages and cultures of Western Europe. This is the origin story of the Indo-European language and how it reached the British and Irish Isles. In the early medieval period, Western Europe was linguistically diverse, shaped by vulgar Latin-derived Romance languages, a range of Germanic tongues, and the remaining Celtic dialects that persisted on the continent's fringes. For the people who spoke them, these languages seemed entirely separate, each rooted in its own region and tradition. Few could have known that they were in fact distant relatives or branches of a much older language. But this all changed in the 15th century after the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama established a direct maritime route between Europe and India. For centuries, the land-based trade routes had been dominated by the Ottoman Empire and Arab merchants, but no longer was this the only way to reach the riches of the East. In the decades that followed da Gama's discovery, merchants, missionaries and scholars arrived in India in great numbers. Many observers were struck not only by the wealth and complexity of Indian civilization, but also by something more subtle. The languages spoken there carried echoes that seemed unexpectedly familiar. As researchers and travellers began to listen more closely, they noticed patterns that reminded them of languages spoken far away in Europe. One of the earliest to notice this was the English Jesuit Thomas Stevens, who arrived in Goa in the late 16th century. In a private letter, he spoke of the similarities between Sanskrit and European languages such as Latin and Greek. These early observations, however, did not immediately spark a wider investigation. It was not until the 18th century that the idea gained real momentum, largely through the work of William Jones. Appointed to serve in Bengal, Jones learned Sanskrit, and in 1786 he delivered a famous speech to the Asiatic Society of Bengal. In it, he argued that Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and several other languages must have sprung from a common source. His research laid the foundation for comparative linguistics and for what would be later called the Indo-European language family, a vast network of related tongues stretching from India to Western Europe. As scholars began to recognize the deep connections between these languages, a new and important question emerged. If all of them were related, then they must have once descended from a much older ancestral language, which they called Proto-Indo-European. Although this language was never written down, it's been partially reconstructed through comparisons between later languages. But where did this ancient language emerge, and who were the first people to take it across a vast part of the world? By the late 19th century, scholars such as Otto Schrader proposed a homeland among the grasslands of the Pontic-Caspian Steppe in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. This region forms a vast expanse of open grasslands between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It's part of the wider Eurasian steppe that extends for thousands of miles across the continent. Schrader believed he could find the original homeland of Proto-Indo-European by studying the words the language once used. By carefully reconstructing its vocabulary, he found shared terms for animals like horses, cattle, sheep, and dogs across many later languages that developed from it. For instance, the word for cattle appears in very similar forms in languages such as Latin, Old Irish, and Sanskrit. This suggests all of these languages come from a common source. Because these animal names remain so consistent, it indicates that the original speakers lived in a society where livestock played an important role in daily life. This fits well with what we know about the pastoral cultures of the Eurasian steppe. Although Schrader's conclusions were based on linguistic evidence alone, later discoveries in archaeology and related fields would provide support, reinforcing the idea that Proto-Indo-European likely emerged among steppe pastoralists. In the 20th century, the Lithuanian archaeologist Marija Gimbutas expanded this idea through what became known as the Kurgan Hypothesis. She connected the early Indo-European speakers to a broad network of steppe cultures, often grouped under the term Kurgan, which dated from the Copper Age into the early Bronze Age. Maria described these Kurgan peoples as mobile pastoralists whose economy revolved around cattle, sheep, and other domesticated animals. Central to her view was the domestication of the horse, which she believed gave these steppe communities an unprecedented level of mobility and eventually a military advantage. A defining feature of her model was based on the presence of burial mounds known as kurgans. These mounds often contain weapons, ornaments, and traces of ritual practices, suggesting to her that steppe culture was deeply patriarchal with a pronounced warrior ethos. Her Kurgan hypothesis argued that these steppe groups expanded westwards in several waves as early as 4000 BC, spreading their language and social structures into Europe through migration and conquest. Among the cultures associated with these migrations, one became especially significant: the Yamnaya culture, which is sometimes referred to as the pit grave culture. The Yamnaya emerged around 3300 BC on the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. They lived as semi-nomadic pastoralists, moving with herds of cattle and sheep across wide open landscapes. Mobility was central to their way of life. They used sturdy ox-drawn wagons with solid wooden wheels, allowing them to carry goods and likely families over long distances. Evidence of these wagons found in burials points to their importance within Yamnaya society. Alongside this, early forms of horseback riding further increased their ability to move efficiently across the steppe. Researchers such as David Anthony have argued it was the Yamnaya who were responsible for the spread of Proto-Indo-European. Unlike Maria, he gave a later date suggesting the Yamnaya-related peoples began to migrate away from their homeland between 3100 and 2700 BC. Anthony believes sudden, large-scale invasions did not drive the spread of Indo-European languages, but instead it happened as a slow process of expansion and integration. In this model, small but influential groups from the steppe moved outward, forming connections with local communities. Through mobility, trade networks, and advantages such as horse domestication and wild transport, their language was able to spread gradually across vast distances. Over time, this steppe-based model became one of the most widely accepted explanations for the origins of Indo-European languages. It offered a framework that aligned archaeology, linguistics, and patterns of cultural exchange, suggesting a shared origin in the pastoral societies of the Eurasian steppe. Although David Anthony's Steppe Hypothesis was widely praised when he published it in 2007, it was still based largely on archaeology and linguistics. In the years since, advances in ancient DNA testing have provided powerful new evidence. Genetic data has revealed large-scale migrations from the steppe into Europe during the Bronze Age, closely matching the timelines Anthony and others had proposed, and confirming that the expansion of groups like the Yamnaya culture was even more extensive than anyone could ever have imagined. A landmark 2015 study published in the journal Nature entitled Massive Migration from the Steppe was a source for Indo-European languages in Europe confirmed that large numbers of people associated with the Yamnaya culture moved into Central Europe around 3000 BCE. Co-authored by David Anthony, the study analysed ancient DNA from nearly 70 individuals across Eurasia. By comparing the DNA from steppe populations, such as those linked to the Yamnaya culture, with that of later European groups, researchers were able to trace patterns of movement over time. These results showed a substantial influx of steppe ancestry into Central and Northern Europe around 3000 BCE. In some regions, this genetic signature appeared suddenly and in large proportions, indicating not just cultural contact, but the movement of entire populations. As Yamnaya pastoralists moved westward into regions such as the Danube Valley and the North European Plain, they came into contact with long-established Neolithic farming communities. From this process of movement and interaction, a new cultural horizon began to emerge, the Ware culture. This culture spread across a vast area from the Rhine in the west to the Volga in the east. Its material remains, corded pottery, stone battle axes, and burial practices beneath small earthen mounds reflect clear connections to earlier steppe traditions. Genetic evidence suggests that in some regions, steppe ancestry replaced much of the earlier male population within only a few centuries. In fact, studies have shown that Ware individuals derived approximately 75% of their ancestry from Yamnaya-related steppe populations, proving that the spread of these traditions involved a massive movement of people. The Ware culture appears to have acted as a kind of bridge carrying Indo-European languages into Northern and Central Europe. These communities combined pastoralism with small-scale farming, yet they retained key steppe traditions, particularly an emphasis on individual status. This is reflected in their burials. Within this cultural setting, early forms of Indo-European speech likely began to diverge into what would become the ancestral branches of Germanic, Balto-Slavic, and the Celtic languages. But this didn't take the Indo-European language to Britain and Ireland, at least not directly. The final stage in the journey of Indo-European languages to Britain and Ireland is closely tied to the bell-beaker culture dating to around 2800 to 2300 BCE. Known for its distinctive bell-shaped pottery, this culture was once thought to represent a single migrating people. However, the earliest groups associated with the bell-beaker culture are found in Iberia. These people had little to no steppe ancestry and descended from the older Neolithic farming populations. This suggests that it began as a cultural phenomenon, spreading through exchange, trade, and shared ideas, rather than a large-scale movement of people. As this cultural package moved into Central Europe, it was adopted by populations who carried significant steppe ancestry, descended from earlier groups, such as those associated with the Ware culture. In this region, the bell-beaker tradition became something different, a fusion of local practices and steppe-derived populations. It was from this Central European setting that the story finally reaches Britain and Ireland. Around 2500 BCE, groups associated with the bell-beaker culture crossed into Britain, bringing with them not only their distinctive pottery and early metalworking, but also their ancestry and language. Unlike the earlier spread of bell-beaker traditions in Iberia, which appears to have been largely cultural, this movement into the British Isles involved a significant migration of people. This became clear through genetic research, such as the landmark 2018 study, the Beaker phenomenon, and the genetic transformation of Northwest Europe. By analysing hundreds of ancient genomes, researchers found that the arrival of Beaker-associated groups in Britain led to a dramatic population shift, with as much as 90% of the earlier Neolithic gene pool being replaced within just a few centuries. The scale of this change was profound. The communities that had built monuments such as Stonehenge were largely replaced or absorbed into the new dominant population groups. It is within this Bronze Age world that the earliest forms of what would later be known as the Brythonic and Gaelic language groups began to take shape in Britain and Ireland. Today, the native languages that descend from this migration, including Welsh, Cornish, Irish or Gaeilge, Scottish Gaelic, and the many others that died out, are often grouped together as insular Celtic languages. Yet they arrived long before the people we call Celts were ever described in historical sources, emerging instead from a much deeper and older process that began on the distant Eurasian steppe.